The night air in the town was heavy, the kind of silence that made even the smallest sounds echo louder than they should. The streets were nearly empty, only a few lamps glowing weakly along the sidewalks, their yellow light barely cutting through the fog that lingered low to the ground. In the heart of this quiet town stood a church with walls that had seen countless funerals, its doors often creaking open to let grief spill out into the world. The building was old, made of stone that had darkened with age, its bells rusted but still capable of ringing out whenever death was marked. It was a place where endings were given order and tradition. But no one in that town could have prepared themselves for the ending that did not end, for the girl whose body they believed was lifeless but who would soon stir in the darkness of her own coffin. Before her story became a nightmare whispered about behind closed doors, her life looked like any other. She lived in a modest house just a few blocks away from the church, with walls thin enough for the neighbors to overhear laughter, arguments, and the small rhythms of everyday life. She was not from wealth, but she wasn't poor either. Her family worked hard to maintain appearances, freshly ironed clothes, clean floors, meals that looked simple but always carried the weight of effort. To anyone looking in, they seemed like a family with stability. Still, behind the curtain of smiles and greetings, there were cracks that people chose not to notice. She was young, still caught in that fragile space between girlhood and womanhood. Those who knew her often spoke of her in warm tones, remembering her as someone gentle but stubborn, someone whose eyes always carried a mix of innocence and something harder, an unspoken resistance. She laughed easily, yet there was a tension in her home that had shaped her in ways she couldn't hide. Her parents, strict and deeply protective, lived under the shadow of control disguised as care. Every step she took was watched, her decisions weighed against expectations. Her life was not her own, though on the surface it appeared ordinary. The man who would later stand at the center of Whispers was part of that same town, his face one everyone recognized. He carried himself with confidence, the kind that came from knowing his family's money and influence stretched farther than most. His charm was practiced, his smile polished, and though people greeted him with warmth, there was a certain coldness in how he looked at others, always calculating, always measuring. To outsiders, he seemed like a respectable figure, the kind of man trusted with responsibility. But those closer knew there was something about him that unsettled, a restlessness beneath the charm, like he was always hungry for more. Their paths had crossed long before the tragedy unfolded. It began with small encounters. At the market, at gatherings on the narrow streets, where polite conversations lasted longer than they should. He saw in her something fragile, something he could hold and claim. She, however, saw in him both a possibility of escape from the walls that confined her and the danger of being consumed by someone who would never let go. Their connection was complicated, a push and pull of attraction, control, and fear. To her parents, his presence was unsettling, but they silenced their doubts, unwilling to confront what was already in motion. Life in the town went on, ordinary and predictable. Children played in the dirt roads until their mothers called them in. Shopkeepers stood outside their stores, leaning on door frames, exchanging news that wasn't really news. The old church bells rang on Sundays, drawing the faithful into pews where sermons stretched long, the air thick with incense and whispered prayers. And in the middle of this routine, beneath the surface of what seemed safe, tension was building quietly, invisible to most. The girl herself had begun to change. Friends noticed the way her laughter no longer came as easily, how her eyes wandered when she sat in silence, as though her mind was far away. At home, her defiance was met with sharp words and strict discipline, the kind of discipline that left her feeling smaller each day. Still, she tried to keep up the appearance of normalcy, even when her heart was restless. It was as though she carried a secret weight, though no one could guess the depth of what was to come. There were whispers already, though faint. Some people noticed how often he lingered around her, how his gaze followed her longer than polite, how he spoke to her with a tone that was less of a conversation and more of a command. Others dismissed it, brushing, away unease with excuses. He was wealthy, respected, and surely harmless. But there are moments when a community chooses not to see, when the silence of many becomes a shield for the dangerous few. The turning point came quietly, with no warning to outsiders. A sudden illness was spoken of in hushed tones, her family telling neighbors that she had collapsed, that she had been weak for days before her body finally gave in. The doctors who came were quick to declare what everyone feared. She was gone. A life so young ended without reason. People gathered to mourn, carrying flowers, standing in heavy silence as her coffin was lowered into the earth. Her parents wept with a grief that seemed unbearable, their cries echoing through the church as candles flickered in the stale air. But beneath the sorrow and prayers, something was wrong. There were signs that no one paid attention to, small details dismissed in the rush to grieve. Her lips, pale but not yet fully drained of color. Her skin, still holding warmth longer than it should have. Her chest, where some swore they thought they saw the faintest rise. Yet grief blinds even the closest watchers. And so, the lid was sealed, the soil was shoveled, and the town believed her life had ended. What no one knew then was that her story did not stop there. In the darkness of the coffin, where silence pressed down heavier than stone, she was still breathing. Weak, shallow, desperate, but alive. And as the days went on, when her absence became part of the town's memory, she remained trapped in a nightmare that no one could hear. The days following the funeral carried a strange heaviness in the town. It wasn't the usual grief that lingered after a young life had been taken too soon. It was something sharper, something uneasy. People mourned her openly, but behind their sorrowful faces were questions they never voiced. Whispers passed in half-lit rooms, over fences, in the corners of shops. Some said her death was too sudden, too unexplained. Others insisted her parents had been hiding something. Still, no one dared to confront the truth because grief has a way of silencing suspicions, making people accept what they're told instead of what they feel. Her parents carried themselves like broken glass, fragile but sharp if pressed too close. Her mother, usually composed and stern, walked about the house with eyes red and swollen, as though tears were constantly waiting just behind her eyelids. Her father buried himself in silence, a man whose pride had always kept him from showing weakness, now crushed by a grief he couldn't control. But beneath the surface of their pain, there was a strange sense of relief, though only those who paid attention could see it. As though with her gone, something they had been fearing would no longer threaten their tightly held lives. The man most people whispered about didn't disappear after her burial. He appeared at the family's home often, sometimes bringing flowers, sometimes sitting in the parlor for hours without saying much at all. His presence unsettled the neighbors. Some found it strange how close he remained to a grieving family, how his eyes didn't carry the softness of mourning, but the sharp focus of someone who had not lost what he believed was his. Behind closed doors, people muttered about his intentions, but when confronted, he masked everything with that polished charm, assuring everyone that he only wanted to help, that, in truth, his obsession had only deepened. Her death didn't extinguish the hunger he carried. It sharpened it. He began to visit the church at night, standing at her grave long after the candles had burned low. There were moments when the caretaker of the cemetery swore he heard whispers, low voices carrying through the fog, though when he looked, there was only the man, kneeling in the dirt, lips moving in words too faint to catch. His grief didn't look like sorrow, it looked like possession. He hadn't lost her. He refused to believe it. To him, she still belonged to him, whether alive or dead. What no one could imagine was that beneath the soil, in the box that was supposed to silence her forever, she was still fighting. Her hands clawed at the wood until her nails split. Her throat screamed until no sound came out. Hours stretched into days, and the darkness became her only companion. She drifted in and out of consciousness, her body growing weaker as panic turned into numbness. She didn't know if anyone would ever hear her. She didn't know if she was already dead and trapped in some cruel in-between. But what kept her alive was not hope. It was anger. anger at being silenced, anger at being caged in wood and dirt, anger at the life that had been stolen before it had even fully begun. Meanwhile, tensions outside her grave thickened like storm clouds. Her parents faced not just grief, but financial strain. Whispers of debt circled the town, debts owed to wealthy families like his. Their daughter's connection to him had not been just a matter of attraction, but a matter of survival. It was said that their home and stability depended on keeping him close, and when she resisted him, their control over her hardened into cruelty. Her illness, if it could be called that, had come at a convenient time, silencing the girl whose defiance had threatened to unravel everything they were holding together. Two, carried secrets that no one spoke aloud. His wealth was not as secure as people believed. Behind the polished shoes and tailor coats was a family name drowning in its own corruption. He needed her not just for his obsession, but for control, for proof to others that he could still claim what he wanted. She had become a symbol of his power, his refusal to be denied. And in losing her, his control began to crack, pushing him deeper into madness. The town itself was part of the suffocating weight. This was not a place where scandal could breathe openly. Everyone knew everyone's business, but no one spoke of it. Women were told to endure, to stay silent. Families were told to protect their name at any cost. Men like him thrived in such silence, using respectability as a shield. And so the truth of her life, the control, the manipulation, the hidden struggles, was buried alongside her body, left to rot under the weight of tradition and fear. But not all were blind. A childhood friend of hers, a boy who had known her since they were small, began to question everything. He remembered the way she had looked at him in the weeks before her death. Tired, distant, but also desperate, as if she wanted to tell him something she couldn't say aloud. He remembered the argument. He overheard through thin walls, her mother's sharp voice, her father's heavy footsteps. And he remembered seeing her with a man, her smile forced, her body stiff, her eyes darting like a trapped bird. After her funeral, he could not rest. His suspicion became an ache he couldn't ignore, and he began to dig into the pieces others wanted to leave untouched. The deeper he looked, the clearer the picture became. There were witnesses who swore they had seen her alive the day before her supposed death, walking the streets, her steps unsteady, but her body still very much alive. There were servants who whispered about arguments behind the family's closed doors, about nights when the man's voice could be heard through the walls, sharp and demanding, followed by the girl's muffled sobs. And there was the doctor, who had declared her gone after only a brief check, a man known to favor those with wealth and influence. The boy's quiet search for answers became another thread of tension, one that could not remain hidden for long. The man noticed his questions, his lingering around places he didn't belong. He watched him with cold eyes, warning him silently to step back. The parents, too, grew restless, worried that the past would be uncovered, that their daughter's ghost would not remain buried. What none of them realized was that the girl herself was still there, alive beneath the earth, her body growing weaker, but her rage sharpening with every heartbeat that refused to stop. As weeks stretched on, the town grew restless. Strange things were spoken of near her grave. Some swore they heard scratching from the earth late at night. Others claimed to hear faint cries, though no one dared to dig, brushing them away as tricks of the wind, the imagination of those two burdened with grief. But whispers like that don't fade, they grow. And soon, her grave became more than a place of mourning. It became a place of fear. Children dared each other to run past it at night. Adults lowered their voices when they spoke of it. The tension built like a storm ready to break. He could not let go. Her parents could not allow their secrets to be revealed. The boy could not stop searching for answers. And beneath it all, she was still there, trapped, waiting, her body weakening, but her spirit unbroken. Every secret, every lie, every hidden truth pressed together like stones on glass, ready to shatter. It was only a matter of time before the truth would claw its way back into the light. The night it all broke open was heavy with storm air, thick clouds pressing down as though the sky itself wanted to suffocate the town. The cemetery sat in silence, its crooked stones glistening with dew, the church looming over it like a shadow that had seen too much. It was there, in that place meant to quiet the dead, teach. At life clawed its way back, shattering the stillness with sounds no one should have ever heard coming from beneath the ground. The boy who had been searching for the truth was the first to hear it. He had returned to her grave under the cover of darkness, driven by the unease that gnawed at him every day. He had heard the rumors, scratching, faint cries, the uneasy murmurs of townspeople who dismissed it as fear or imagination. But he couldn't ignore it anymore. As he stood before the mound of dirt, he held his breath, straining his ears against the whispering wind. And then it came, the faint, desperate sound of fists hitting wood, muffled but undeniable. His heart stopped, then slammed back to life in his chest. She was alive. He tore at the soil with his bare hands, dirt filling his nails, sweat mixing with the damp earth. His breath came ragged, his body trembling as adrenaline flooded him. The ground seemed endless, the weight of the soil too much for him alone. He shouted for help, his voice breaking into the night. At first, no one came. People were too afraid of the cemetery, of the stories whispered about restless spirits. But when his cries grew louder, desperate and frantic, lanterns flickered on, and others came running. What followed was chaos. Men with shovels attacked the earth, their strikes fueled by fear and disbelief. Women clutched their mouths, eyes wide with horror, as the truth became harder to deny. And then, when the coffin was finally reached, the sound stopped. For one breathless moment, the world held still. The lid was pried open, wood splintering beneath tools and hands. And there she was, her face pale, streaked with dirt and blood from clawing at her prison, her lips cracked and gasping for air. Her eyes fluttered open, wide with terror, staring at the crowd that had gathered above her like specters. She was alive, barely, but undeniably alive. Screams erupted, some of horror, some of disbelief. The boy fell to his knees, tears burning his eyes as he reached for her. She tried to speak, but her voice was a rasp, her throat raw from days of screaming into silence. Her body was weak, trembling, every breath a battle. Yet her eyes, those eyes carried a rage so sharp it silenced the crowd. It wasn't just survival in her gaze. It was an accusation. And then, as the townspeople reeled from the impossible truth, he appeared. The man whose shadow had loomed over her life pushed through the gathering, his face pale, but his composure still clinging to him like armor. For a moment, his mask cracked, shock flickered across his features, but it was quickly swallowed by something darker. He knew the truth had broken free, that his hold was unraveling. The girl's parents arrived soon after, their grief-stricken masks slipping as they saw her alive. Instead of relief, fear flashed across their faces, fear that their carefully crafted story had been destroyed. Her mother clutched her chest, whispering prayers that sounded more like curses. Her father's jaw tightened, his eyes darting not to his daughter, but to the crowd, calculating what this meant for their name, their debts, their survival. As the townspeople tried to lift her out, chaos erupted. She cried out, her voice breaking as she pointed a trembling finger toward them, toward the man, toward her parents. Her words were hoarse, but the meaning was clear. They had buried her alive. The crowd gasped, recoiling as though the accusation had burned them. Murmurs turned into shouts, questions hurled like stones. Faces that had once looked away from the cracks in her life now burned with anger, betrayal, and fear. The man's composure snapped. He shouted, denying it, his voice shaking not with sorrow but with fury. He tried to twist the truth, claiming it had been an illness, a mistake, a tragic misunderstanding. But the people had seen too much. Her broken nails, her bleeding fingers, the bruises that told stories no one could deny. And as the weight of evidence pressed down on him, his charm shattered into desperation. He lunged toward her, wild-eyed, as though silencing her once more could erase what had been revealed. The boy threw himself between them, rage and fear fueling his strength. The two clashed in the dirt, fists swinging, shouts piercing the air. The crowd surged, pulling them apart, holding the man back as his screams grew animal-like, spitting curses, demanding she be silenced. His mask was gone now. His obsession, his madness, lay bare for all to see. Her parents, cornered by the growing crowd, broke in different ways. Her mother sobbed, words tumbling from her lips, fragments of confession mixed with denial. She spoke of debts, of fear, of how their daughter had become a bargaining piece in a game they could not win. Her father stood silent, his face like stone, but his silence was louder than any confession. He had allowed it. He had chosen power and survival over his own blood. The scene was a storm of shouts, accusations, and panic. Lanterns swung, casting wild shadows across the gravestones. The girl, weak but burning with fury, clutched the boy's hand, her body trembling, but her eyes locked on those who had wronged her. The crowd, fueled by horror and betrayal, pressed in on the man and her parents, their voices a chorus of rage. In that moment, the fragile balance of the town collapsed. Respectability no longer shielded him. Silence no longer protected them. The crime, once buried with her body, was dragged into the open, raw and undeniable. What had been hidden in shadows now burned in the harsh light of truth, leaving no one untouched. The aftermath began instantly. Some rushed to her aid, carrying her from the cemetery, their voices gentle, their hands trembling as they tried to comfort her. Others held the man back, their anger boiling over as he fought like a trapped animal, his screams echoing into the night. The parents were swallowed by the crowd's fury, their pleas drowned out by the sound of betrayal given shape. And in the center of it all was the girl. Alive, broken but unyielding. Her survival was no miracle of chance. It was a defiance against everyone who had tried to silence her, a testament to a will stronger than the earth that had tried to hold her down. The crime was no longer just a secret whispered in fear. It was a wound torn open for everyone to see, bleeding into the heart of the town, staining the lives of all who had looked away. The cemetery never felt the same again after that night. For days, people avoided walking past it, their steps detouring down side streets rather than facing the fresh mound of disturbed earth that now stood as a reminder of what had been uncovered. Whispers filled the air, but they were no longer the hushed kind that could be brushed away. They were sharp, angry, full of disbelief and betrayal. The girl had been buried alive, not by mistake, but by deliberate choices, and everyone who had once chosen silence now carried the shame of looking away. The man was taken under guard almost immediately, but even as he was dragged through the streets, his voice did not falter. He shouted his innocence to anyone who would listen, claiming that the girl had been sick, that her family and the doctor had misled him, too. Yet his words held no weight anymore. People had seen his face when the coffin was opened, had watched his desperate attempt to silence her again. His composure was gone, and in its place was the truth of who he really was, obsessed, dangerous, and unrepentant. The mask he had worn for so long had cracked, and there was no putting it back together. Her parents faced their own reckoning. Her mother dissolved into tears at every turn, her voice breaking as she tried to explain herself. She spoke of debts, of threats, of the crushing weight of expectations that had left her paralyzed. She begged the town to understand that she had been a victim too, trapped by a man whose wealth and power had twisted every choice they thought they had. But the town had little sympathy. She had watched her daughter suffocate in silence long before the coffin closed, and in their eyes, that was unforgivable. Her father said almost nothing. He kept his back straight, his expression cold, as though holding on to dignity would save him from disgrace. His silence became his condemnation. People said he had always been too proud, too concerned with appearances, too desperate to hold on a status that was already slipping through his fingers. In his refusal to protect his daughter, he had protected only himself, and now there was nothing left for him to cling to. His reputation, once respected, was now rotting in the same earth his daughter had clawed her way out of. The girl herself became both a symbol and a wound. For the town, she was the embodiment of what they had all failed to see, or refused to see. Her survival was called Morocco, Laos, but to her it was nothing of the sort. She bore the scars of her ordeal, not just on her body but deep within. Her nails were ragged, her fingers torn, her throat scarred from screaming where no one could hear. Sleep came in fragments, broken by nightmares of what pressing in on her, of voices muffled by dirt, of silence swallowing her whole. She was alive, yes, but she was not untouched. Every time she closed her eyes, she was back in that coffin, and no amount of sunlight could fully take her out of it. The boy who had fought to uncover the truth stayed close to her side, his presence both a comfort and a reminder. He carried his own scars, though invisible. He had been the one to hear her first cries, the one to pull at the dirt with bleeding hands, the one to see her emerge from the coffin like a ghost. That image never left him. He walked with the weight of knowing that if he had ignored his instincts, she would have been lost forever. His loyalty to her deepened, but so did his guilt, because he had not been able to save her from the suffering, only from the final silence. For the wider community, the scandal tore through every layer of their lives. Families who had once held the man in high esteem now spoke his name with disgust. His wealth no longer shielded him. In fact, it only fueled the outrage, the idea that money and influence had allowed him to prey on others in plain sight. The parents, too, became outcasts. Neighbors who had once shared smiles and greetings now crossed the street to avoid them. Their home, once a place of forced order, became a cage of whispers, their walls thin enough to let the town's judgment seep in. The media caught hold of the story, carrying it beyond the borders of their small town. Newspapers printed headlines that screamed of horror, buried alive. Young girls escaped from the grave. Reporters arrived in droves, eager to capture the scandal that blended tragedy with spectacle. The family's name, once guarded so carefully, was now plastered in ink for strangers to dissect. The man's face, once polished and charming, was sketched in dark lines, his eyes drawn wild to match the madness people had seen in him. And the girl, fragile and pale, became a figure of both fascination and pity. Her story was told and retold until it no longer felt like her own, but a tale that belonged to everyone else. The legal consequences came swiftly. The man was charged, not just with attempted murder, but with a string of crimes that surfaced once others found the courage to speak. Servants who had been silent now told their stories. Women who had feared him now admitted what he had done. His obsession with control, once whispered about in corners, was now laid bare in courtrooms, each testimony another nail in his fate. He denied everything until the end, his arrogance unshaken, but his words no longer mattered. Her parents faced a different kind of punishment. Though they were spared the harshest legal charges, they could not escape the judgment of the town. Their complicity, whether through fear or choice, marked them forever. The mother's tears no longer moved anyone. The father's silence became a wall that cut him off from the world. They lived not in prison, but in exile, locked in their own shame, their daughter's survival a living reminder of what they had allowed. For the girl, healing was not simple. The physical wounds slowly mended. Her hands regained strength. Her body began to recover. But the deeper wounds lingered. Trust became fragile. Every creak of a door, every M.O. Men of silence in a room made her chest tighten. Crowds overwhelmed her, yet solitude frightened her even more. She lived in the constant tension of being both safe and unsafe, of being alive but still haunted by the grave she had escaped. The boy stood by her through it all, but even he could not reach the parts of her that had been broken in the dark. Some nights, when she woke screaming, he would hold her, but her eyes would not see him. They would see the coffin, the dirt, the darkness pressing in. Survival had come at a cost, one that no court or crowd could repay. The town moved forward, but never the same. The church bells still rang, the market still opened, children still played in the dirt roads. But beneath the routines was a shadow that would never lift. They had seen what silence allowed, what power unchecked could destroy. Every grave they passed reminded them not just of death, but of the girl who had risen from it, carrying both the weight of her survival and the judgment of those who had failed her. The crime had ended, but its echoes spread far beyond that night. It lingered in every conversation cut short, every glance that shifted away, every memory of a girl who should have been mourned but instead became a testament to the cost of control, silence, and betrayal. The trial that followed was the kind that people never forgot. The courtroom was packed every day, neighbors squeezing into the benches, their faces tense, their eyes fixed on a man who had once walked their streets as if he owned them. He no longer looked polished or composed. The confidence had drained from him, replaced by a cold bitterness. Witness after witness spoke against him. Servants, townsfolk, even those who had once stayed silent out of fear. The truth of his obsession and cruelty was laid bare, and for the first time, his wealth and influence could not shield him. When the verdict came, finding him guilty, the room erupted, not in cheers but in a heavy silence, as though the town itself finally exhaled after holding its breath for too long. Justice, at least in part, had been served. Her parents did not face prison bars, but their punishment came in other ways. The mother, broken and frail, carried her shame like a sickness. Her tears, once seen as excuses, were now the constant mark of guilt she could not escape. She lived with the knowledge that her silence and fear had cost her daughter everything, and no amount of crying could wash that away. The father, however, remained as rigid as ever, his face a mask of stone, refusing to confess or to bend. But his silence condemned him all the same. He lost his standing in the town, his reputation shattered, his name spoken only in bitterness. The house that once seemed a symbol of pride became nothing more than a prison of shame. The girl, though alive, lived with wounds that no sentence or punishment could heal. Her body recovered slowly, her strength returning with time, but the memories refused to fade. She carried the coffin with her in her mind, the suffocating dark always lurking at the edges of her thoughts. Some days, she could smile, laugh even with the boy who had saved her at her side. But other eyes, the weight of what had been done to her pressed so heavily that she could hardly move. She was not just a survivor, she was a reminder. To her, to the town, to anyone who heard her story. Her life would never again be the simple, ordinary one she had had before. The boy himself bore his own share of scars. He became both protector and witness, standing beside her even when he felt powerless against the shadows that haunted her. He was praised as a hero, the one who had not ignored the whispers, the one who had clawed at the dirt to reach her. But even with that came the burden of memory. He could never forget the sound of her faint cries beneath the earth, the look in her eyes when she was pulled into the light. Being called a savior did not erase the horror of knowing how close he had come to being too late. The town was not the same either. The scandal had shattered the illusions of safety and respectability that so many clung to. They could no longer pretend that wealth and reputation meant morality. They had seen how power was abused, how silence had allowed cruelty to fester, how fear and pride had cost a young woman her freedom and nearly her life. The case became a warning, a story that parents told their children, not just to frighten them, but to remind them of the cost of looking away. The newspapers that had once turned her tragedy into a spectacle eventually moved on to other stories, other scandals. But the memory stayed in the town, etched into its stones, whispered in its streets. Laws and practices began to change, small but meaningful. Doctors were held to stricter standards, burials examined more carefully, and the possibility of premature declarations of death taken more seriously. It was as though the horror of her survival forced people to confront not just her story, but the fragility of life itself. Beyond the legal and practical changes, the deeper impact lay in how people began to see each other. There was a newfound suspicion of those who carried too much power, a recognition that charm and influence could hide darker truths. Families who once prized silence began to question whether it was worth the cost. Women who had long suffered quietly under the weight of control saw in her a reflection of their own struggles, and some found the courage to speak where they once would have remained silent. Still, the story carried no simple ending. Justice had been served in part, but justice is never clean. The girl could not reclaim the years she lost, the innocence that had been stolen. Her parents could not undo their betrayal. The town could not erase the guilt of having looked away for so long. And the man, though punished, left behind wounds that stretched far beyond prison walls. What her story revealed was not just the cruelty of one man or the weakness of one family. It revealed the cracks in an entire society. A society that valued reputation over truth, silence over protection, control over compassion. It showed how easily power can twist love into possession, how fear can turn parents into accomplices, how communities can blind themselves to what they don't want to see. In the end, her survival became both a triumph and a tragedy. A triumph because she had defied death itself, clawed her way back from a grave that was meant to silence her forever. A tragedy because her survival carried with it the unbearable weight of knowing what had been done to her. Not by strangers, but by those who should have protected her. The story of the girl found alive inside her own coffin was more than a tale of horror. It was a mirror held up to human nature, to the darkness that lurks in control, in silence, in the pursuit of power at any cost. And in that mirror, the two, WN, the family, and even the world beyond were forced to confront uncomfortable truths. As time passed, life moved forward. Children grew, seasons changed, and the church bells rang for other funerals. But her story never truly ended. It lived in the pauses of conversations, in the sideways glances when her name was spoken, in the cautionary lessons passed down to those too young to remember. She lived on, not just in the fragile breath she fought so hard to keep, but in the way her story reshaped those around her. Justice had been served in the courtroom, but true justice was something deeper, something harder. It was in the lessons learned, in the voices no longer silenced, in the recognition that survival is not just about breathing, but about being heard. And though the girl's scars would never fade, her survival carried with it a truth stronger than any lie, a truth that no coffin could ever bury again.